Good day, fellow champions of inclusion. I am Aaron, and this is the Inclusive Dad podcast, where we explore inclusion and make it practical. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me in exploring ways we can create a more inclusive world together. You are important, you matter, and you can make a difference. Today, my guest is Paolo. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Aaron. It's a real pleasure to meet you. I'm grateful to have been invited and really looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah. Why don't you start us off by just telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm always like to start my presentations when I talk about my work in diversity, equity, and inclusion by describing myself as the white elephant in the room.
Okay.
What is a white dude like me doing talking about diversity and inclusion? And I came into it from a very unusual angle in that I spent most of my career, first as an academic and then as a consultant, working on a unique approach to analytics that has the ability to connect what an individual is doing and how that relates to how the collective is doing, whatever. And that's in a very general sense. So my academic studies have to do with studying the brain and how neurons can combine to give us things like vision and the ability to move and see and hear and things of that sort. And then I eventually left academia and became a consultant in a company where we used computer simulations to explain to companies how the way that they treat their customers eventually influences their sales, how they treat their employees influences their success. And I had been personally interested in DEI, but always felt that, look at me, what am I going to do? I'm not really an activist. And then one day I saw this opportunity about 10 years ago to bring to bear my analytical background to help quantify the impact of the way that companies treat their employees, especially as it relates to diversity and inclusion. And I thought if I could quantify the financial benefit of treating their employees better, it would become a much more compelling argument for leaders than just simply saying, oh, this is the right thing to do. It's fairness and justice. And so I got into that space about 10 years ago, and I've been really extremely fortunate. I love my work. I love the fact that what I'm doing has an opportunity to have an impact, that especially right now with the backlash against DEI, my work offers kind of a unique approach that avoids all of that. And so I'm particularly happy to be doing this work right now.
Yeah, that's great. How do you define the terms diversity, equity, and inclusion?
One of the biggest problems that I found that I like to think that I'm making a big impact is that those terms have been defined very unclearly and inconsistently. I mean, diversity, I think most people would kind of tend to agree of what that means. But when you ask 10 people what inclusion means, you're going to get literally 10 different answers.
Right. Yeah.
And equity also, there's all these debates about should it be equality, should it be equity, is it equality of opportunities, equality of outcomes? And people just get really twisted up about that. I have spent a lot of time using these computer simulations and this research to try to understand very clearly what I mean by diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the way that I talk about it is from the point of view of an organization. Inclusion is what you do. Diversity is what you get. And what I mean by that is that inclusion to me is a reflection of whether you're allowing things to happen within your organization that cause different experiences for different kinds of employees. If that is the case, you're not being inclusive. And the reason why diversity is what you get is because if you have a group of people that is less satisfied than another group of people, even though they have exactly the same qualifications, it means that less satisfied group of people will actually be less likely to stay in your company. They're going to leave, which means that your retention rates will be lower, which means that you will have less diversity. And this is something that is very well known. I mean, we all know that any company that tends to have, let's say, few women or few members of the LGBTQ plus community or few people with disabilities also tends to have very high turnover rates for those same employees. And so that's why I say inclusion is what you do, diversity is what you get. I then talk about equity by saying equity is what you want. And what I mean by that is actually that if you think of the fact that people who are less satisfied are leaving the company, which means you're going to have to pay to rehire people, but they're also producing less before they leave, which means that you're losing top line revenues and you're increasing your costs by having to rehire people. So if you are creating something that is inequitable within your organization, that is causing one group to be more satisfied than another, that difference is what I call an inequity. And your goal should be to drive that inequity to zero so that you're saving money. In other words, you want equity because any form of inequity will actually cost you money. And so the argument that I give people is completely different. Instead of saying sprinkle magic diversity dust and all of a sudden things will get better and you will somehow become a better company, I say you're bleeding out money right now. I can show you how much money you're losing as a function of how inclusive you're being. I can show you how that impacts your diversity, and I can show you how to improve matters so that you will actually make more money and have happier employees.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. For me, I got into the inclusion piece just because I have a daughter with this disability and just her being segregated. So yeah, you are right. Like everybody has inclusion in my mind is one thing, and we were talking about it with the school to get her included in the classes, and it was obvious after a while, like their definition was completely different. So it's very important to like understand like that we both understand what each person has as their definition. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Is DEI a form of reverse discrimination?
So I love that question because I think so. And this is where sometimes I diverge in opinion from some of my colleagues in DEI. People get upset in DEI when they say, "Oh, there is no such thing as reverse discrimination. It's just discrimination." And why do you call it reverse discrimination? Well, that's how a lot of people complain about it. The reality is that if you set targets on the base of diversity for a company, and those targets propose to increase the representation of one group of people, it means that you're decreasing the representation of the other group of people. And unless you can like literally double or triple the size of the company, then you're effectively saying in order to increase the number of women, I have to decrease the number of men. Now, that is discrimination based on gender or race or whatever the case might be. However, even though I understand that argument, what I point out to people is that it's based on a very flawed assumption, which is that the way to fix the lack of diversity is to stuff more people from diverse backgrounds into organizations. And I think that that's where the idea is wrong. What do I mean by that? Well, imagine you walk into your house in the winter one day and it feels really cold, and you look at the thermostat and it reads 50 degrees. How do you fix it? You light a match under the thermostat. And look, now the temperature is 60, 70, 80, 90 degrees. But meanwhile, the windows are drafty, the front door is open, the roof is leaking, and you might burn the house down. When we try to crank more diverse people into companies, that's exactly what we're doing. We're fixing the symptoms instead of trying to understand the causes. Instead of figuring out why we're leaking people out, why it is that at the entry level, according to McKinsey, white men in US organizations make up about 34% of the population of the workforce. By the time you get to the executive level, it's 57%. So you have gained 23, 24 percentage points at the expense of the other groups, which means that you're bleeding out women, you're bleeding out people of color, you're bleeding out people with disabilities. Why is that? So we need to understand where the leaks are and stop them. It's like having a leaky bucket and just pouring more water from the top is creating a mess. And part of the mess is that it causes people to complain of reverse discrimination. And in fact, I've written plenty of articles, and in my book, I talk about the fact that setting diversity targets on representation alone is a big mistake because it is a form of reverse discrimination. And now we're seeing the mess that results burning down the house when now we have the president of the United States that's writing executive orders wanting to shut down everything DI, claiming that everything in DI is illegal. And that's really unfortunate. So it's one of those things where we get hung up on these definitions and try to describe them without really asking what are the assumptions that are underlying those definitions and where could we do better?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because you are right. It's led to this thing where, if you just are adding people with disabilities, for instance, than other people, and you don't increase the company size, you have to get less of the others, and then you get these emotions attached to it that leads to where we are. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and if I may, not only that, but if you hire somebody, let's say that you hire somebody with a disability just to check that box, but then your organization has impediments, whether it's a physical disability or whether it's somebody that's neurodivergent, so or even you hire Black people into a company that does not welcome them, they're the only ones. What's going to happen to those people? Well, they're not going to thrive. They're not going to succeed. They're going to end up quitting a few months later. And then the people inside the company will say, oh, see, we tried it with those people, but it didn't work out. And meanwhile, those people are like, oh, this place sucks. Don't go work there, right? So you're really shooting yourself in the foot and you're creating this very vicious cycle. So it's really something that I think that people need to think very carefully about the assumptions that they make and sort of reason their way through and say, well, what is the implications of what I'm suggesting? And in this particular case, I think that we have been so focused on diversity alone that we've forgotten that diversity is just the symptoms that we see as being problematic. And then we try to fix it directly. And that's where all the mess is happening.
Yeah, for sure. And similar stuff like you just shared about happened, like, in my school with my daughter, like we want her in the classroom. So, they put her in there, but they don't give her the support she needs to actually be successful. And they're like, hey, this isn't working. It's like, no, that's not inclusion. You're not supporting her. You're just throwing her
Yeah.
in there, calling that inclusion, and you can't use that as your whole case study. So that makes a lot of sense too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Why would I hire someone who is less qualified?
Well, you shouldn't hire somebody who's less
Yeah.
qualified, but I would give two answers to that. Okay. The first one is when we make statements about someone who's less qualified, lowering the bar, you're making an assumption that you have the ability to know exactly who's going to be better and who's going to be worse. And one of the things that I tell people when they ask me questions like that is I say, okay, I want you to show me the mathematical equations or the set of rules that you have
Right.
to define qualifications. And I want you to show me that you've been measuring those systematically for the last 10 years and that you have proven to yourself and to me that those metrics actually reflect accurately who is going to be succeeding. If you are not able to do that, then shut the hell up, because you're just talking about an ideology. You're telling me that you know who is a better employee just by looking at the resume. So there is that aspect of it. There's also the aspect of it that sometimes when people look at qualifications, it's like, oh, well, we need a computer programmer. You should be able to type a certain number of words per minute and write so many lines of code and find so many bugs. But maybe you're going to hire somebody who on paper looks great, but who turns out to be a complete jerk that makes everybody else miserable. Or maybe you're hiring somebody to a job where the actual work that they're doing, they realize is not very meaningful and they don't produce very much. So the whole idea of having this hypothetical bar and hiring somebody that is less qualified is really, it's a silly idea. And unless it's backed up by evidence, it's just an ideology. Now, having said that, unfortunately, this is, again, another mistake that we in the DI space have made, is that unfortunately, sometimes just to check that box of diversity, they've desperately looked for somebody. They don't know where to look for candidates. They don't know how to attract the right candidates. They end up with a very small pool of candidates that come from diverse backgrounds. And then they hire somebody who is probably not as qualified as they should be. And then they throw them into an environment where they're not going to succeed. So again, this entire idea of hiring the best, et cetera, is founded on a set of assumptions that are usually tacit assumptions that are very questionable. And so, no, you should not hire a person who is less likely to succeed in your company. But unless you have a way of actually measuring that and ensuring that those people will have a fair chance to succeed when you get in the company, then I'm sorry, but you're just making stuff up and you're using it as an excuse to continue to hire the same people that look like you, that went to the same schools that you did, just because that's an easy, comfortable way to judge somebody's likelihood to succeed.
Yeah, for sure. What is the business case for DEI? I think you already talked a little bit about it.
Yeah, and actually I talked about that a little bit, and I want to emphasize one important point. When people talk about the business case of DEI for DEI, in many cases, they point to macroscopic data, a lot of it published by McKinsey. And by the way, some of that same data has been questioned in terms of the methodology. But there are these data that tend to show correlations between the level of diversity of a company and the financial success of the company in various ways, right? But there are some really deep problems with using that kind of thinking. First of all, a correlation does not imply that one thing is causing the other. So if you see a correlation between diversity and financial performance, you could assume that companies that are more diverse make more money. You could equally assume that companies that have more money can afford to be more diverse. Or you could assume, as I actually prove in my work, that it's having an inclusive environment that leads to companies that are both more diverse and more highly performing, which is why sometimes you see this performance. So the first problem is that we're using an argument that is just wishful thinking. You cannot go to a leader and say, oh, look, there's this correlation, therefore it's a causal link. But there's a second problem, which is that when you go talk to a leader and they ask for the business case for something, they don't want to know about correlations over thousands of companies. Imagine going to a leader and saying, oh, look, we did a study between the color of a product and the probability of selling it or sales. And we find that red products tend to do better. Oh, great. Let's make all of our products red. That's just simply not the way that companies work. What you need to do if you want to make a business argument is you need to show the leaders, how will my choices of what I do impact my company? And that's where the work that I do, I take pride in the fact that when we talk about the business case, we're literally showing companies, here's how much money, given your demographics, given your levels of engagement, satisfaction, inclusion, whatever you want to call it, here's how much money you're bleeding out today. And then if you measure inclusion the way that we do it, and I can come back and explain what I mean by that, we can pinpoint exactly what are the actions and the behaviors in your company that are causing some people to be unable to perform at their peak, and that actually hurts you financially. And then we can calculate an ROI. So we can literally demonstrate the business case for their company based on their employees and the experiences that they have in the workplace because of the culture and the way that the company works, which is a much more compelling argument than, oh, look at these, vague correlations between diversity and performance.
Sure. So how do you, when you're looking at a company, what are some things you use to calculate, like show them how it can help them?
Well, one of the things that we realized is that diversity by itself doesn't really tell you much. It's like diversity is like the balance sheet. It tells you where you are today, but it doesn't tell you how you got there. And when people they say they measure inclusion, typically what they do is they ask people, how included do you feel? Or how do you feel that our company is an inclusive culture? To me, those are really kind of useless questions, because knowing how somebody feels doesn't explain to you why they feel the way that they do. If somebody does not feel included, or they don't feel like they fit in the company, you need to understand what is happening day to day that causes them to feel that way. And I give an analogy with health, right? Inclusion is a bit like health in the sense that we notice when we're sick more than we notice when we're healthy. And we tend to notice when we're excluded more than we notice when we're included. So inclusion itself is kind of invisible. And one of the problems with that is that if you are very healthy, you don't know a lot about diseases. If you're always included, you don't know a lot about exclusion. Well, if you're a leader in a company, you're never really excluded. And so the leaders are the ones that are least qualified to understand what happens. So how do you fix that? How do you do that? Well, in medicine, they ask you about symptoms. They want to know, is it a problem is it a digestive problem? Does your stomach hurt? Or does your elbow hurt? And then they want to know, is it muscular? Is it digestive? Is it cardiac? Whatever problems might be. And then they ask you about the causes. Oh, your stomach hurts. Did you eat something weird? Your elbow hurts. Did you bump into something? So we took a page from the same book and we said, well, look, let's think about the clusters of symptoms of things that happen in the workplace. And so our symptoms, what we call our categories of experiences, are things like compensation and benefits, career advancement, recognition, work-life balance. And then what the sources are things like company policies, leadership, management, your peers, your clients. So we ask people using a confidential online platform that is completely untraceable to individual people. We ask them to share specific experiences of things that happen to them that interfere with their ability to work. And we're very careful. We don't want to know things that make you feel excluded, because sometimes we feel excluded for reasons that have to do with a combination of our personal experiences and our professional work. We just want to know, look, tell me something that happened to you. Somebody might say, I was supposed to get invited to a meeting where decisions were made that impacted me, but the manager forgot to invite me. And they might list that as an example of what we call, access and participation, and the source might be the manager. But they might say something like, I sent my laptop to IT to get repaired 3 weeks ago and I still haven't got it back. Right. Now, if it turns out that you get 100 people that describe that kind of experience, and 80 of them happen to be women, and only 20 are men, then you know that there is a problem. You know that the company's being exclusive. And when you hear the stories of what exactly is happening, you can say, oh, I see what's happening. What's happening is that managers are systematically forgetting to invite everybody that should be there. How do you fix that? Well, you give managers a spreadsheet where you say, okay, keep track of everybody that should get invited to every meeting. And we're going to judge you on that. We're going to actually use it to hold you accountable. And if we see that you consistently forgetting to include people in meetings, you're going to get penalized for it. When you do that, you're not saying, oh, let's make the company more inclusive for women. You're saying, let's create, let's create a better system to organize meetings, and that will benefit women more than men, but it will also benefit the men. And that's another reason why you avoid that whole backlash and discrimination.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, that's great. How do we overcome that backlash against DEI?
I think so. My opinion, and this is, of course it's subjective, but what I'm working on right now is a number of articles that we're putting together into. I've written one book, by the way, that came out recently, and I'm now working on a second book with a friend and colleague of mine. But basically, what we're trying to say is that, look, let's start with the fact that we believe that most people would agree that it's important that if you are qualified for a job, you should be able to apply for that job and have the same chance as anybody to get it. And that once you decide a job, if you're performing well, you should be able to succeed and advance regardless of your identity. So I think that most everybody, regardless of which side they're on, would agree with that. And then let's strip out all of the garbage, all of the rhetoric, all of the hatred, and just say, look, let's come up with some ways of measuring these things and quantifying them in a way that is objective. Everybody will agree is objective. And let's focus on how by doing so, we can actually ensure that everybody is able to succeed in an organization and that the organization makes more money. And if you talk about it that way, you don't start with identity, you don't start with fairness and justice, but you also don't start with these claims about like, oh, it's a meritocracy, when you're not actually really measuring anything. Then if you put those things together, you're not creating backlash because you're basically avoiding anything that is controversial. You're not favoring one group. You're not saying, oh, let's find out what is the group that is the most excluded so that we can fix things for them. It's like, well, in a way, to me, that's backwards. I would rather, let's find out what are the biggest problems that impact the largest number of people in the organization. Let's fix those. And we have lots of data showing that when you do that, you will automatically benefit most the people who have been the most impacted. And so there is like, the expression, the rising tide lifts all boats equally.
Yep.
Well, in the case of inclusion, it's even better than that. I have this picture that I use where I show, imagine like three basins, like a high basin, a middle basin, and a low basin. And there's a little boat in each one of them. So you have these three boats at three different levels. And the idea is that the basins represent kind of the structural, societal, imbalances that cause some groups to be better off than other groups. Mm-hmm. Well, if you rain down inclusion on the whole landscape, you're not sucking water out of one to give it to the other. You're literally raining down inclusion on everybody. What that does is that it lifts all the boats, but it will lift the boats that were at the bottom more than the ones that were at the top already. So everybody benefits, but the people that were the most excluded benefit the most. And when you look at it that way, you see how you can avoid the backlash, and yet you are, in a way, benefiting more the people that need it the most. So I'm very excited because people that have been reading my book have been really positive about it. They feel that it's one way to completely avoid the backlash. In fact, I even include that in the title of my book. I talk specifically about the backlash in the title. And I'm very excited about the opportunity to try to get some cooler heads to prevail and to avoid some of this backlash that we're seeing.
Yeah, I love that. Why are white leaders resisting DEI?
There is this is another thing that I talk about in my book, and I kind of hinted at it when I was talking about that idea of inclusion being invisible. I think that it is true that there are some groups that are actively resisting DEI. There is no question about it. Yes. Unfortunately, I think that they're able to get widespread support because of some of the missteps that we've made, because of the fact that we created the sense of reverse discrimination, because of the fact that we've created vague definitions of inclusion and equity. But in reality, what I find is that for most white leaders, the problem is not that they are against DEI. The problem is that they just don't see exclusion. As I mentioned, they're included all the time. So if somebody comes to them and says, oh, this happened to me, they might think, oh, it's an isolated incident. Oh, well, maybe you're exaggerating a little bit. They don't get it. They don't understand what it's like. So what I try to do is I try to give them data that shows to them very clearly what is actually happening to your people and how often it's happening. I've had on more than one occasion, on 2 occasions, I've had white male CEOs that when my company gave them a report of what was going on inside their company, they literally broke down in tears and said, I cannot believe this crap is happening under my watch. So I don't believe that most leaders are against DEI. What they are against, and what a lot of people I'm hearing from are saying, oh my God, finally, I felt like I've been getting yelled at and screamed at and told that I'm a bad person without really giving me any opportunity to understand what I need to do better and how I need to do it better. And yes, they did not like that. And I completely understand that. I think that a lot of the DEI activities that have gone on, especially in the 2 years following the murder of George Floyd, 2 to 3 years, they backfired because they basically told people, you're guilty, you're an oppressor, you're hurting people, you're being unfair, and then they say like, oh, you got to do all this work. It's a marathon. It's really difficult. And, we can't quantify it, but, it's going to be really good down the road. Yep. And if you're a CEO, that puts you in a really horrible position. And so, so people react negatively to the specific ways that DEI have been proposed and implemented. But I believe, and I talk to a lot of guys who look like me, they all want to do the right thing. But they need to have the right evidence, the right data, the right tools, the right recommendations in a way that aligns with what is their responsibility, which is to make money for their shareholders and to satisfy their board, satisfy investors. So if you go to a leader and you say, oh, you need to do the right thing, and oh, hey, it's going to cost you money, it's going to piss off your employees, it's going to piss off your customers,
Yep.
I'm sorry, but they're not going to like you.
Yeah.
And you can't expect that. You're selling a product and you're doing it by making people feel guilty. The
Yeah.
product sucks. And then you complain, oh, they're stupid, they're evil because they're trying to block DI. No, they're just they're trying to block some things that have not worked very well, that actually have caused them a lot of pain and a lot of losses.
Yeah.
And that's completely reasonable. So I think it's up to us to create a better product and to come up with better messaging that will actually align with their needs instead of forcing them to do something that goes against their interests.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Last couple of months are like your perspective. I mean, are people still wanting to do what's right with DEI, or is with everything going on, a lot of people are way more hesitant to even talk about it or go down the path?
So both, actually.
Okay.
It's been kind of interesting for me and my company particularly. It's been interesting because we had been building momentum in terms of companies that wanted to measure inclusion, which is kind of our bread and butter.
Yeah.
Part of what we do as the measure inclusion, a lot of it is education. It's providing workshops and training sessions where we explain these ideas about how you measure inclusion, what it means, what have been some of the missteps done in DI, et cetera. Now, what's happening is that a lot of the bigger projects are being put on hold as companies are trying to rebrand. And that ranges from, just making a few cosmetic changes to making some really profound changes and eliminating a lot of DI. But what's happening is that even though some of that work is diminishing, the demand for me to go, and especially me in person, to go speaking and doing training and things like that is going through the roof. I'm doing 4 podcasts this week alone. I'm doing, I've done interviews. I've been at already like 4 or 5 conferences since the beginning of the year. I've spoken at multiple companies. And what's happening is that when people hear, they're desperate for some solutions that can enable them to continue to do work that benefits their employees, because even if they don't like DEI per se, they understand how crucial it is to make sure that the workforce is satisfied and productive, because ultimately people are the largest budget item of every single company on the planet. And so they understand that. And so what I'm seeing is a range from companies that are fully committed to DI, that are basically trying to make sure that they're not doing anything that will run afoul of the executive orders, and that will at the same time continue to prove to their employees that they are in fact behind them and supportive of them.
Yep.
And at the opposite end of the spectrum are the people that are like, okay, well, this was all BS anyway, and let's kind of like relabel it and change it, etc. But everybody in between wants to know, is there a better way to do this? And when they hear about my work, I'm very happy to say that I'm getting a ton of attraction because of the fact that, as you hear, I come at it with a very different mindset. It's, I believe I'm motivated by fairness and justice, but that's not what my work is about. My work is first and foremost about rational decisions, scientifically driven methodology, data-driven approaches, and arguments that are grounded in kind of logic and business logic. And then secondarily, like, to me, I'm motivated by the fact that in doing so, I also feel that I am helping to compensate for some incredible disparities that have undoubtedly happened and continue to happen in our society. And so, but it's, again, it's the outcome versus the causes. I'm trying to focus on the causes, hoping that it will lead to the right effects instead of trying to fix the symptoms and creating more problems.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What is one tip that you can share to help our listeners today be more inclusive? Maybe because of the work that you do, what if I'm in a company where it's not as inclusive as I feel it should be, and I want to change that, but I'm not in management? What's something I could do to, try to push or help my company become more inclusive?
I would suggest a couple of things. I mean, one of them is try to separate out cause and effect. And what I mean by that is, instead of focusing on things like culture, which is really a very intangible thing, or the feelings of inclusion, try to remind yourself that what really matters is the day-to-day experiences at work. And that those don't necessarily have to be, racism, sexism. Think about what are the things that make a person satisfied at work. And so even if you're an individual, try to think in the way that you interact with other people. And by the way, I'm not a big fan of this idea of unconscious bias. We have unconscious biases and we can't fix them. The problem is when organizations have processes, policies, systems that allow those biases to have a negative impact on other people. Now, having said that, we as individuals, we can certainly do things. It's not about be nice to the Black person and invite them to lunch. It's more about make sure that, hey, if you're a manager and you're organizing meetings, be careful that just like, oh, look, John ran into Mark in the hallway, and they're like, oh, let's make decisions right now. That's when you do that, it's like, okay, I'm excluding people, maybe inadvertently, but I need to be more careful about it. If you're assigning projects, don't lean on the person that you like because you feel very comfortable, because you get them, because they're like you, because they went to the same school. Be mindful, anything that you do in your work that is impacting other people, be mindful that you're not inadvertently creating a bias or an imbalance.
Right.
I think that's the most important thing for individuals. For companies, what I would say is don't give in to the political rhetoric. Right now, DI is being used as a wedge to drive hatred between groups of people, unfortunately.
Right.
And to me, it's also been used as a red herring to hide the fact that what is happening right now is that they're basically destroying, for example, the government, right? They're firing tens of thousands of people in the name of efficiency. And it started with like, oh, these are all DI hires that are inefficient. But are they actually firing people based on DI? No, they're firing indiscriminately a bunch of people. So what I would tell people is try to resist the rhetoric, recognize it for what it is, which is political maneuvering, whose ideals have nothing to do with fairness, justice, or with the success of businesses. It's really a different kind of ideology. And so try to stay away from that and just try to think about rationally about what can I do to ensure that my company is as successful as possible, and how can making my employees happy help to achieve that goal. And I think that that's something that a lot of leaders could take to heart and really appreciate that. So
that's great. Where's the best place for everybody to connect with you?
A couple of things. One of them is if you go online, you can find my book, Measuring Inclusion. There's only one titled, Measuring Inclusion. Amazon or any other booksellers. And then the name of my company is Aleria. It's ALERIA, and then it's .tech, TECH.
Okay.
Unfortunately, .com was already taken, but we are kind of a tech platform. So Aleria.tech. That's the best way to get a hold of me. Or if you look up my name on LinkedIn, there are not a lot of Paolo Gaudianos, especially in this space. So all of those are fairly easy ways to learn more about our work and get a hold of me.
Awesome. Ready for the last question?
Of course.
Do you like spam lunch meat? Yes or no?
I like it mixed with other things. Like I recently had some spam fried rice that was quite good.
Okay. There you go. Yeah, I live in Austin, Minnesota, where they make spam and where the spam museum is located. So I've been asking all my guests, just kind of a fun to see if they like it or not. So
yeah,
spam.
Very good.
I've only had it a couple of ways, like fried, like or sliced and then fried, or like cut up like in a macaroni salad. So I should probably try some different ways too. But
yeah, no, I've seen a lot of interesting recipes. I was just in Texas recently, and they use spam a lot in a lot of different dishes, and in the right context, it can be quite good. I'm not a fan of it like raw, sliced, and put on salads, but I do like it. I have to say, fried, it tastes pretty good.
It's not bad. Yeah.
Well,
thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you, Aaron. Really appreciate your questions and your time.
To those listening, thank you for allowing me to be part of your journey. It is truly an honor. Please join the podcast newsletter by clicking on the link in the episode description to keep up with the latest episodes. Together we can make the world more inclusive. Until next time, stay empowered and be a champion for inclusion.